Welcome to the 85th episode of the New Ventures podcast. I'm your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. In this episode, we pondered the question of needing to revamp our education system to meet the challenges of our times. Our guest for today is Tom Kane, the program director of an artificial intelligence-facing business analytics course at the University of Stirling.
Thank you very much, Sanjoy. It's lovely to be with you.
Tom, we'll jump right in. From business analytics to Tagore's education approach and pedagogy. That's obviously not a linear career progression.
Well, let me just first of all say that Tagore was very keen on theatre, and business is a kind of a theatre. It's a kind of important theatre for national economies and international economies. I liken a business to a bunraku puppetry from Japan, where you have three people as puppeteers of one beautiful object of imagination, this great puppet with somebody working the head and somebody working the hands and somebody working the feet. Well, that's what a business is. And it's a thing of drama. So how it lives and how it operates in the world, how it's created and what it does on stage, all of these things are works of drama. These are not constrained to a theatre. These are actually in the world with us. So they're quite exciting in the sense that they need to be taught ethics, business ethics. They need to be taught how to deal with the environment. And they need to be appreciated and loved for what it is that they do for the economies. But yes, it's absolutely a step. And in particular, at this time of artificial intelligence, where artificial intelligence is going to go right through business practice, we need to make these new items of business and these new businesses themselves responsive to the ethics, professional ethics of our society and our societal norms. So yes, it seems a big step. And in particular, it seems to be a big step from the beautiful artistic poetic work of Rabindranath Tagore, but there are other elements of Tagore where it chimes very nicely because he ran a business. He was a zamindar. He ran a school and then he ran a university.
And for those of our audience who do not know what a zamindar is basically a person in pre-independent India who owned property and estates, if you call it, and basically collected rent from peasants. But Rabindranath didn't actually do very well at zamindar. He moved to more industrial businesses, right, Tom?
Well, he was asked to become a zamindar by his father when he was 30, so he was very young. And I don't think he was unsuccessful. People used to come to learn about. He innovated. People didn't like what he did, but he wanted all of the accounts kept carefully so that everybody could understand them. But the big thing that happened with him, Sanjoy, of village life and his despair at how difficult it was to live that kind of life in the beautiful environment in which it was set. So yeah, his time as a zamindar. A zamindar is like a tenant farmer, but with duties of responsibility where people have problems. If people need a new school, they might go to the zamindar and say, could you help us to fund a new school, which he actually did in his region.
When you started studying Tagore, did you actually learn Bengali?
No, I did try. I bought a book which is called Learn Bengali in 30 Days. I didn't pull that off, but I do love the sound of Bengali and I sing a lot of Bengali songs and I meditate. I have lots of interests in Bengali history. My spiritual teacher was born in Bengal. So when he wrote lots of songs in Bengali, then I learned those songs.
Then you had this fellowship which enabled you to go down to the university Tagore founded, which we shall talk about, right?
Yeah. So I had a long-standing relationship with Professor Bashabi Fraser, and Bashabi knew that I had this. I think she probably thought it strange at the time too, this interest in Tagore. Well, she was working at the University of Napier, where I also was working, and she said to me, look, we have these fellowships to Vishva Bharati, and some of the things that I had been doing, I had been linking schools with real-world objects outside the schools, Sanjoy. For instance, I was linking classrooms in state schools with operating theatres in the NHS and with museums where artists were talking about winning prizes and speaking to the higher art students and showing them how to become better artists. So my interest was linking with the real world, and Bashabi knew that, and also my love for Tagore. And she said, look, why don't you become part of our schemes, UKRI, UK Research Initiative, and go to Vishva Bharati. So it was the chance of a lifetime, and I loved it. It was wonderful.
And Dr. Bashabi Fraser actually was on our podcast about a couple of years back, explaining the importance of Tagore's overall philosophy in the context of climate change. Do listen to that podcast if you haven't. Let's talk a little bit about Rabindranath Tagore. For many of our audience, he's probably an unfamiliar person, but he was the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913, but he was a lot more than that. Tom, you've already talked about his business and his setting up an university. Elaborate a little bit on his thoughts around education. And, some of his thoughts around education probably started from early learning difficulties, if I can use it, the modern term for that.
Yes. Oh, well, that's a really nice space, Sanjoy. Well, maybe I should start that in the 19th century, education in Bengal became a very hot topic. There were lots of Christian missionary schools who were converting children to being Christians, and there was a fear that there was a loss of traditional Indian education. And there was a renaissance through Ram Mohan Roy, who started up his own school and wanted to teach a more modern version of spirituality and educational mores to the children. So he reinvented something called the Brahmo Samaj. This is a little bit roundabout, but he was the teacher of Rabindranath Tagore, who was Rabindranath's father. And Rabindranath went out of his way to try to make education available to the poor. It was more focused on Indian traditional and cultural values and spiritual values. So that was going on at the 19th century. Tagore was the last child of a very large family, and everybody was grown up, and he was forced to go to school. So for him, it was a kind of imprisonment because the excitement of his household was just wonderful. So I think he was a naughty boy. He went to 4 or 5 different, maybe 6 schools. But he stopped going to school at the age of 13. It may be that he just couldn't take the imprisonment of that environment and how different it was from his own life.
Basically a self-taught person in some ways, right, Tom? And his interest in educational philosophy sort of became more formalized later on in life.
Yes, yeah, I think what he liked, Sanjoy, was that you would not get the answers to something the first time of reading. When he, for instance, in the libraries of the house, he would read Charles Dickens, and he didn't understand all of it, but he loved the bits that he did understand, and he found it a great mystery, the things that he didn't understand. And he treasured that. His education was to find out things and to be in wonder about things. So that imaginative part of Rabindranath was very strong, and he was a poet. That's his thing. He was a poet. He had poetic sensibilities, and he had that openness to the world and to human beings. So I think it was always going to be a unique path through education that he would take.
In your paper, you talk about how Tagore's thoughts on education were influenced by J.C. Bose and Patrick Geddes. None of these names are going to be familiar with our audience.
Tagore was being educated. He was being educated alongside somebody called Jagadish Chandra Bose. Both of the fathers were interested in the Brahmo Samaj. Well, it just so happened that Jagadish Chandra Bose turned out to be one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century. He studied at Cambridge. He studied under Lord Raleigh at Cambridge. He took up on electromagnetism at the very early days of electromagnetism. And he started to experiment with transferring radio signals across Calcutta, and he very successfully developed the first semiconductor that was used. But both of them were wide open to a spirituality, which was that there was a great being that inhabited all elements of the earth and of the universe. And that this great being, it had its own connection with the universal reality, and what we do on the surface of our being through our mind and through our activities complements that. And if there can be a proper relationship between what we are on the surface and what we are deep within, then we can get to this sense of reality that we're all essentially connected in a very deep way. That probably is the core element that joined J.C. Bose with Rabindranath Tagore. They read the Ramayana, they read the Mahabharata, they read the Upanishads and the Vedas. So they were very knowledgeable about ancient Indian culture and the value of it and what it was actually saying, this Brahman that's part of all beings. And it was part of their modern exterior as well as their interior religious life. Patrick Geddes was a town planner. He did a wonderful amount of work in Scotland and subsequently in India. He did town planning for 24 or 25 cities in India. And his idea was about having sympathy with the environment and synthesizing the elements of that with the modern environment and with the needs of the environment, and then synergizing those, energizing them again to make a brand new way forward. These three people together, J.C. Bose, Patrick Geddes, and Rabindranath Tagore, turned their particular interests into Tagore's concern for education and helped him in his development, and Geddes helped him in developing the educational program.
What I'm already understanding, and it's becoming clear to me, is Tagore's ability to absorb influences from various types of people. Dr. Bose, who is a physicist, as you said, Patrick Geddes, who is a town planner, not an Indian in the first place. That is essentially, to me, Tagore, his ability to absorb influences and make something of it bigger out of many, many parts. And we'll jump in and understand Tagore's philosophy in education. I did read last year, actually, several of his essays once again. One thing that struck me is this very strong emphasis that Tagore put on learning in one's mother tongue, which is Bengali. Then obviously there's a historical context behind this, but maybe you want to just explain that to our audience.
Yeah, when he was young, there wasn't a great deal of modern literature. There was no modern literature written in modern Bengali. And there was certainly nothing written for children. So one of the reasons he probably didn't enjoy school too much was the kind of texts that he was having to work from. But he himself greatly respected the need for language, the mother tongue to be your first steps from which you move into education and to understanding the world. He, for instance, was keen for people to think of his educational place as a nest where people with all sorts of different cultures and all sorts of different languages could come and relax and rest and share their experiences with each other. And that meant their culture and their language too, giving you your own culture an important place within this heteroglossia of many other languages and cultures.
And the reason I started with that question is because places in the world, because I come from the climate change angle, the places in the world with the highest concentration of indigenous languages is also the highest concentration of biodiversity. And we are losing both in an astonishing space, losing both biodiversity and the number of indigenous languages. My question to you, Tom, is that you think about education. There are benefits of globalization and the benefits of speaking in English like you and me are doing. In this 21st century, how should we absorb this importance of learning in one's mother tongue, say in Africa or somewhere else?
Yeah, I'll give you an example. I have a friend who works with helping Indigenous communities to be fairly treated by governmental officialdom. There was a project she was working on the Bay of Bengal, and it was with Indigenous peoples who had a chance to go and apply for funding to help them as poisons were rising in the ground and as waters were coming into where they were living. But they were excluded from the professional English that's used by the managerial classes from expressing what they actually needed with nuance because they didn't have the technical professional vocabulary of the English that was required to do that work. She worked very closely with communities whereby they can express what they need as in their nuanced way. As you'll know this, Sanjoy, with communities with their own unique languages, people are just as brilliant there as they are anywhere else, and they're just as careful as they articulate things. It's a different language and maybe different idioms. When they're interpreted properly, and presented towards governmental questions, then people themselves are allowed to stand up for themselves. This kind of opens up the door to the artificial intelligence thing a little bit, because with these chat GPTs, these generative, pre-trained and transformative tools, we would be able to allow the idioms of all these natural languages around the world to express exactly what they want in a professional English that could then be sent to governments. But we could also translate the requirements and questions from governments into these natural idioms. So there's a possibility, Sanjoy, of doing a two-way connection between government and the people living in these areas of biodiversity who must be serviced sometimes through this period of climate change.
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting that you brought up large language models at this point in the conversation, because I really wanted to understand that in a little bit more detail. But just sort of to help our audience get the fundamentals of Tagore's philosophy and education, apart from learning about mother tongue. And what Tagore did was to put the balance between learning about science and technology and learning about arts and culture, strike the perfect balance around this. And to me, this is a little bit of an important point, because in climate change, the discussion is sometimes too much, in my opinion, about science and technology and less about the social sciences. What do you think about this?
Absolutely. So one of the reasons that I, funnily enough, set up my Master's in Business Analytics at the University of Stirling was to help students from the arts and the social sciences, because although these AI tools are very powerful, they don't have a great deal of cultural support. The people who have to wield these should really have the kind of vision that social sciences has and the arts have, so that they can be used properly for society. All of the different schools, there's a Vishwa Bharati Chinese school, there's a Japanese school, there's the arts school, there's the social sciences. For me, actually, the fact that Tagore's university exists and has thrived, I think it's one of his largest achievements. And he did, by making it a central university, and has become so proud of it and has grown it. Yes, social sciences will never be small on the agenda.
So I think what I'm hearing from you is that sometimes these courses are often siloed, right? If you're taking a course in arts, you're just studying arts. If you're taking a course in political economy, you're studying that. I think it's very interesting that you've brought up this business and analytics course for students of social sciences, the arts, because that allows people of different sort of faculties to come together and have conversations about the modern world.
Yes, absolutely. I find that personally an important thing, because we mustn't lose our arts and social sciences students from this moment. It cannot just be technologists who are guiding the use of tools such as artificial intelligence and cyber physical systems and smart cities and autonomous vehicles and modern government. I want to have somebody who understands social work, art and history, thinking about these things. And that's exactly what Patrick Geddes was. He was the kind of person who understood the importance of all sorts of input into the proper functioning of society at that higher level. So yes, I completely agree with you that the importance of social sciences arguably has become much more important since the onset of these new AI methods just 2 years ago.
Exactly. And then we come to what I consider the third tenet of Tagore's philosophy and education. And this you have already brought up. You use those powerful words, connecting one's surface self to one's internal self. And at the internal self, we are all the same. We can come and relax and have a conversation with each other. This is really Tagore's philosophy about education, isn't it?
Yes. Yes, it is. And I think it's wonderful. It's one of the other reasons that I so strongly link with him. He did a series of lectures called The Religion of Man, and it adds up to that he talked about Jiban Devata, which was his inner life lord, which was in some ways guiding his life, as well as happening at the same time as what was happening on his surface life. He would see this backwards and forwards. There was a moment where he was in his zamindari in Shalaidaha, and the rain was coming down. And he said he had a movement of soul where he had close sympathy and understanding of the life of the people in the village. And And he felt that their life was just not exciting enough and it was just not as engaged. But he felt this great spirit through himself and through those people that was the same spirit. So I often go back to the fact that he also loved his father very dearly, and his father was heavily influenced by what's one of the great Upanishads, which was the Isha Upanishad, which is the Upanishad of being. There's just 3 little slokas that describe what that Isha mostly talks about. The first sloka is, all this is for habitation by the Lord. Whatever is individual universe of movement and the universal motion, by that renounced thou should enjoy, lost not after any man's possession. Doing verily works in this world, one should wish to live 100 years. Thus it is in thee and not otherwise than this. Action cleaves not to a man. The idea that all of this is a play of a divine spirit at a very deep level, and that try not to lust after anyone else's property, because that's not going to help you in any sorts of way. It's going to get you entangled and lost. Wish to live 100 years doing the best you can. That, I think just those 2 slokas really just talk very deeply and truly about what meant the whole world to Tagore.
Tom, one last thought which I had as you were speaking about the slokas, you don't really have to believe in supreme being to understand that people can come together and live for 100 years and do meaningful things with each other. You don't even have to be a believer, if I can use that word. You can well be somebody who is agnostic or atheist to really appreciate.
Absolutely. And absolutely, that was the joy of it all. And Rabindranath was never someone, he never forced any religious perspective on anyone. He was open to all races, all religions, and atheism. He was very eclectic and universal in that sense.
We'll be back soon after a break. And in that second part of this episode, we are going to get into the applications of these ideas that Tagore put together in a place called Shantiniketan and Vishwabharati, which Tom has already referred to. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you very much, Sanjoy.
Tom, I've actually been holding you back a little bit in the first part because you started talking about Vishwabharati and the university Tagore put together. What is interesting about Tagore's thoughts and education, compared to many others perhaps, is that he put them in practice.
Yes. So there's a few things. One thing was that he started from working with young people in a primary school setting in Shalaida when he got there at the age of 30. Then he thought it would be good to have a new university. That's what Vishwabharati was. So after the devastating First World War, Rabindranath's response was, we need a world nest university. And that's why he set about setting up Vishwabharati. Then in 1940, which was a year into the Second World War, and a year before Tagore died, there was a visit to Vishwabharati by Mohandas Gandhi, and during that visit, Tagore asked Gandhi to take care of Vishwabharati University, which he described as a vessel, the cargo of his life's best treasure. Gandhi readily agreed to that, and as a consequence, Vishwabharati University became a central university of India, thereby achieving national recognition and distinction, and also financial security.
I didn't know that, and I didn't quite link this up with the world wars. But as you are speaking, I'm thinking that in the 1940s Education Act, which was actually a bipartisan act in the UK, was actually sort of thought about towards the end of the Second World War. The world war was still continuing as the MPs of the British Parliament thought about education, and that Education Act had a long influence in the UK as well.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, what I treasure, Sanjoy, is how we responded to the devastation of the Second World War. Those instruments, of international and national instruments that we established in 1946, 47, 48, right up to the United Nations, all of the different means whereby ordinary folk were given better education by their states, I think it's one of the greatest
And to me, this is the
achievements.
core of this. As we are sort of in the middle of this devastation of nature and the devastation climate change is going to cause on our own societies, human societies, we really have to respond back with education. That's really why I'm talking to you, Tom.
Yes.
And to help us understand this, Tagore's core point was education in the midst of nature.
Yes. Okay. So I think one of the things was he didn't have a great deal of finance to start up. I mean, the achievement of what became Vishva Bharati was the work of one poet and many people who loved him. I mean, as you said earlier, Sanjoy, he was a great networker and he was a great absorber of other people's ideas, but he was also a great influencer too. Education under the trees refers back to the Upanishads, the Upanishadic tradition of sitting with a master, sitting at the foot of a master and learning, and often the base of a tree, where the Buddha, for instance, had enlightenment, and Vashishta's great ashram of the time of the Ramayana, where people would come and they would learn outside. So it helped Rabindranath to help to educate people from the local villages. He wanted to do that. That's the first thing actually he established. It was established before Vishva Bharati, was Sriniketan. Sriniketan is the abode of well-being. And he wanted that for the villagers. And he felt that they could have their education in the landscape in which they worked. And that's what he did. It's a very benign landscape too, you'll know this. Beautiful even when it's raining. It's hard work when it's raining. So what he brought was entertainment and education and expansion of consciousness and mind and possibilities for life, not just for boys, for girls too. Almost from the beginning of he was a wonderfully gender equal educator. I really admire what he was able to do so early on in the 20th century in education, particularly for young women and girls in coming to his bhavan and learning how to dance comfortably without any implication that they were going to go to a life of dissolution.
This is really great. And you brought up something which I found so interesting. He didn't have a lot of money. He actually made a virtue of frugality, right? And in fact, in one of his essays, he says, why do you need money to build a building? You just go out and learn under the tree. And the reason I bring this up is because, my work in Cambridge is I work with Professor Jaideep Prabhu, whose entire life is basically about frugal innovation. We don't need to spend billions of dollars or pounds into the climate transition. We can do it just by being sensible.
Absolutely. In the middle of Vishva Bharati is the house that his father originally built, which is Shantiniketan. That was the name his father gave to it. It's a bungalow and it has 2 levels to it. And he used to sit out on the top level and write all day. This is the other thing people don't quite know about Rabindranath, is how hard he worked. He worked every day. He was writing all of the time when he wasn't working on his university and his schooling. And he would be there in the rainfalls, just when it was bouncing off the ground. And he would be aware of people in tents, for instance, and protecting them. When he first moved to Shilai, there were British people coming to perform functions, and they were living in tents. And he knew they were being washed out. He would bring them into his house. So he understood his environment, he loved it, he respected it, and when it was benign, he used it for education. Again, this idea of classroom without walls. The world is our educational space as well as our living environment. That was very important to Rabindranath.
From this small place, he brought in the world's best thinkers to Vishwabharati and Shantiniketan. C.F. Andrews, who studied in Pembroke College, Cambridge, Leonid Ernest, who studied in Cambridge and then went to Cornell. How did he do that?
Well, I think that was liable to be through his lectures in Oxford on the religion of man, and most importantly through the collection of poetry, Gitanjali, Song Offering, which was almost certainly the basis of him winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. Just a little segue on that. As a consequence of Rabindranath winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913, he was subsequently honoured by King George V in his birthday honours list of 1915 with a knighthood. Rabindranath returned that knighthood in 1919 as a consequence of the Amritsar massacre, where nearly 400 people were killed who were peacefully demonstrating. I think that action marked Rabindranath as a notable intellectual and humanitarian. He was a poet. There were some things he just would not tolerate. But at the same time, people recognized his humanity, his poetic skills, and then they also realized what he was achieving. So meeting with Rabindranath, it was a meeting with a being of a very high human stature. That was the most important thing about him. His spirituality was within the details of everyday life. He was a wonderful person. Romain Rolland and Einstein, all sorts of people were really bowled over by Rabindranath.
And to me, the fact that he brought them over and they lived and they interacted with young people helped the young people, I suspect, develop a world vision, yes, which is what we have to develop if we have to solve the problem about climate change.
Yes, absolutely. One of the fears, you'll be aware of this more than anyone, I imagine, the loss of trees. Just the idea that he did all this work under trees, but when we look at what's happening around the world with these very high-speed winds and these hurricanes and then the deforestation that we're looking at, the importance of our natural environment to who we are, I just think it has to come central stage, and this is a very good time to do that, to keep that message alive that we must have a sustainable environment. We should aim to hand our environment on to our next generation in the same good repair that we found it. That sustainability question, I think it's looking back at what Rabindranath achieved. Yes, I think it has a new importance at this time, particularly with the new technologies coming to Sanjoy.
You've been there, obviously, and to be honest, I haven't. Give us an insight into the curriculum, the teaching methods. What should modern universities be learning from Tagore's thoughts?
Okay, well, he was cultural. He was a storyteller, so it starts from there. When he started his school, he was telling the youngsters stories. Well, there's a dance, Bhavan, at Shantiniketan. There's storytelling. There's music. Of course, his achievement in music is he's responsible for the national anthem of India and the national anthem of Bangladesh. Some of his music was used in the national anthem of Sri Lanka. So music was hugely important to him. But short stories, dramas, plays, when you go through, there are interior buildings within Vishva Bharati. And when you go through those buildings, there are all sorts of youngsters performing, and they're creating and they're performing in all of these great arts. And there's a whole societal development that's going on with all of that. There's a huge excitement of being there amongst all those creative youngsters and those teachers. And then outside, they are genuinely teaching under the trees. At least they were in 2016 when I was there. And, well, there's an atmosphere too. When you're walking around watching these youngsters concentrating at the feet or at the seat of the teacher and learning, it just gives you a thrill of the possibilities of our race, that we can simply educate each other to the highest level of each individual's ability. You'll know that people like Satyajit Ray went through there and made some of the most beautiful and important films of the 20th century, and that's continued on. The current filmmaking that's going on in India is, again, pushing all sorts of boundaries. So, firstly, culturally. Secondly, educational. Then science. He would have had science in at the beginning. And in fact, if Jagadish Chandra Bose hadn't started the Bose Institute before he had started Vishva Bharati, I'm sure he would have joined him. But the Bose Institute, as you well know, has become such an important part of educational and research life in India. But they just couldn't find a science teacher at that time to start the scientific side of Vishva Bharati. Well, they have now. They've got 10 different disciplines of science going on within Vishva Bharati. So for me, it was a very welcoming environment, lovely on-site premises. There's the central building, which is where Tagore's father built the building that was called Shantiniketan. And there they would have meditations every week. Yeah, the spiritual side of Vishva Bharati is as strong as the educational side. But it's a personal spirituality that's invited upon an individual rather than something that's imposed upon an individual.
And we've come to the end of the podcast, Tom. This has been wonderful speaking to you. You're very special to have linked the Oriental with the Occidental, and Tagore himself would have been proud of you. I'm going to end by asking you a question which I've been dying to, and I know you've already referred to it a couple of times. Can we think of a generative AI model which digested Rabindranath's writings, many of which are in Bengali, but of course some are in English, and help the young person of the climate rebel, if you may, help him or her develop this message of hope? Because I think the word that you used, I found that so powerful, the possibilities of our race. Is that possible?
Well, okay. So again, Sanjoy, this is a huge question. So currently with GPT, we're only at the beginning of that, and it's an extraordinary achievement. So some examples of it, we had a few years ago, Lou Reed, the great rock and roll artist, passed away, and his partner was Laurie Anderson. And Laurie Anderson is a great artist in her own right. Well, somebody did exactly what you're suggesting. They put all of Lou's writings into a large language model and then gave it to Laurie as a present. And Laurie was thrilled with that. She has spent time talking with it, and it brings her a succor and it brings her comfort to be able to speak with her partner of many years and to hear his sense of humour in generated new responses as well. So she, strangely and surprisingly, she said she enjoyed using it. And I think it's quite meaningful for her. But then you've got another artist such as Nick Cave. There was a competition recently to take all of Nick's lyrics and then to ask the GPT to write a song in the spirit of Nick Cave. Nick Cave's response to that was really visceral, and he was very unhappy with it. He just thought it was an appalling thing to do. He talked about the need to disassemble himself and to start from the beginning for every new project that he develops. There's not that he goes over his past materials and he makes a new Nick Cave song from that. There's a brand new element of creation in everything he does. Rabindranath was active in so many different areas at the same time. So I personally don't think we would ever get... You could get the different states of mind that he was in at different times in his life. If you think of Aristotle, you might think you might want to get all of the works of Aristotle put into a GPT and then you could speak to Aristotle. But you couldn't, because Aristotle changed through his life. Aristotle developed as he went through his whole life, and certainly Rabindranath did too. So I think we could approach some of the states of mind he was in at different points of his life. We would have to pinpoint those and train these GPTs to exactly that, if we wanted to do that. But I think it wasn't mental activity that made him outstanding only. It was who he was and his inner being as well, and the development and movement of his inner being that made his life so extraordinary. So I think he's safe from a GPT Rabindranath. But from what you were talking about, the idea of taking his environmental work and helping a young environmental warrior to understand through his poetry, I mean, you'll know the poems and songs that he wrote about the environment and the beauty of it. Well, to get the essence of some of that, I think that would be possible.
Tom, this is very interesting. I get the point about you cannot have a large learning model digest all of Tagore's thoughts at one shot, if you may, because the large learning model would not necessarily have the understanding of the historical context in which it was written, understanding of his own mindset when it was written. And that is really interesting, in my opinion. But of course, you could potentially take parts of Tagore's philosophy.
Well, the thing about the temporal nature of a human being is that we change in time. We have our being is defined in time, and time is defined by our being. So the one thing that a GPT doesn't deal with well is time. And in particular, it doesn't deal well with a human being is transformed over time. How, for instance, a criminal at one point in their life can become peacemaker in another point of their life. And that's happened with so many people in so many of our different cultures. If anybody wanted to tarnish that person's reputation, they would stick to the criminality. And then if anybody wanted to laud them and make them angelic, potentially even inappropriately, they would deal with the peaceful side of that person's life. So the GPTs don't deal well with time. What were the things that changed people over the time and who they were at those times? And would you want to meet a 12-year-old Aristotle or a 30-year-old Aristotle or a 60-year-old Aristotle? That kind of thing. Those they just can't do. But they can. They're extraordinary in their generative ability. So the GPT thing, that they will generate a response for you one word at a time. P for the pre-trained. It's pre-trained and it's taught to use good language that's appropriate in a questioning scenario. Now, it's questionable how we're doing that, so we have to be very careful with it. And in the transformative, that we are looking at language on hundreds of levels of neural networks, different idioms and different points of importance, and we are linking and pattern matching quite similarly to what happens with the human brain. It's an extraordinary time in this area, and it goes back also to the business analytics side of it, because a business is essentially a human theatre in the world and it contributes to economics and economic well